Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Be More podcast, where we inspire you to be more of every role within the Salesforce ecosystem. Today's session is one I've been looking forward to for a while. We are talking about being more well architected, and I'm honored to be joined here today by Susannah. So, Susannah, without further ado, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Susannah Plaisted, and I am an architect evangelist at Salesforce.
For today's session, we are talking about being more well architected. So for the following questions, that's your role. So could you give our audience an introduction to what that means as a role?
In general, when we're talking about being more well-architected, we're making sure that we're following the well-architected principles to design solutions. So we're talking about whatever you're creating as an admin, you could be a developer or an architect by title. And to be more well-architected, you would just follow the principles of thinking about the concepts of trust, easy, and adaptable. And those can be applied whatever your role is in the Salesforce ecosystem.
I think it's good to remind our audience there of these principles, and this framework kind of fits whatever role.
If you're not familiar with the framework, so well-architected is a couple of things. So it is a framework that's going to help you make sure that you're building healthy solutions with Salesforce products. And it's also a series of white papers that cover a set of topics, all under those three pillars that we discussed. And in those white papers, what it contains are patterns and anti-patterns and things that you can essentially look for in your organization or in your documentation to know if you're sort of heading in the right direction. And all the guidance is available on architect.salesforce.com.
Awesome. That's great for our audience to check out after the session. So again, imagining your role is being more well architected. How would you say this interacts with other roles?
That's interesting. So I think that in general, you're interacting with no matter what your proper role is, you're working with customers, right? You're working with your stakeholders that want to use Salesforce. So I think in your role in that way, it's making sure that you're not just an order taker, right? You're not just taking in whatever user stories or requests or feature enhancements that someone's requesting. You're not just taking those in, and you're also not just solving problems creatively with Salesforce. I think that's a place where a lot of people find themselves once they're over the hump of learning about how to do the basics. Then you get, as a technical person or as a practitioner, you get sort of inspired to make these creative solutions. You're like, I can't believe I did this. And I took this and I did this out of the box thing. And isn't this so clever that I did this? And that can be really fun. It's a fun place to be, but that's also not being more well architected, right? Just because you came up with this clever way to do something doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best way or the only way. So I would say balancing those two of being an order taker or being so creative and so smart that you create this thing that maybe isn't going to last over time.
Yeah. Okay. And that's really important, right? Having a system that's sustainable, you can swap bits and pieces in and out as you need it.
Absolutely. Resilient, that doesn't fail. That is, maybe you're following, what I like to say is you're following the most direct path in engineering, right? You're not trying to fit something into a space that it shouldn't just because it's the only way you know how to do it or because it's very creative or something like that.
Yeah. And I think I can certainly speak from my own experience here of kind of falling into the trap of making it fit a particular solution. That's always not a great idea either, is it?
Right. And that's, you're that, especially if you're an architect or even if you're another role, you are that advisor to being well, maybe we shouldn't do it this way. And actually a better way to approach that is to being transparent about what are the risks of taking this approach. So, because, as someone who's ultimately working for a customer that has business needs that wants something done, they're not going to love no, we shouldn't do it. That's not smart, or that's not the right way to do it. So you want to provide solutions, right? And you want to provide the pros and cons and the trade-offs involved in choosing one thing over another. And that's, I think, ultimately one way to be more well-architected.
Yeah, no, definitely. And kind of thinking about the longer term as well. I recently was working with a client and I kind of pointed out to them, well, over a year or so, you're going to have over 1 million records that do this thing,
Right.
How's that going to impact your system? Is it going to slow it down? Are you going to start to experience data skew? Like all of those things start kind of buzzing in your head, right?
Yeah, and definitely, and not just identifying them, but also then coming up with some proactive solutions. So saying, this is interesting, like in this many years, we're going to have this many records. Here are some options of what we can do, what fits you best, so that you're always presenting solutions with the challenges that you're highlighting.
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation about pros and cons sometimes. You typically play the role of being well architected full time, right? Because you don't necessarily park your ambitions there for other means.
Right. I think you need to keep being well architected in mind sort of at all times, because the great power and responsibility, but also risk that comes with being someone who's making these architectural decisions, whether or not that's your title or not, is that the choices you make can have really long lasting effects. So if you, were to take your well architected hat off, and be like, well, on Friday, I'm just not going to worry about it. What if you end up having to make a decision on Friday that's going to have lasting impacts, for like 5 years down the line of a project? So you can't ever sort of let your guard down. You always need to be thinking in that long, sort of with an eye to the long term at all times.
Yeah, definitely. That makes perfect sense. So for those people that are kind of wanting to learn more about this and perhaps trying to get started in being more well architected themselves, what tips or advice would you give to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say start with understanding the concepts of the framework, right? So what are the considerations that you should keep in mind? And then I think the other big thing to keep in mind is the fact that everything in well architected is in priority order, because you can't, even though we said you want to be like thinking about being well architected at all times, that's great, but you can't be thinking about everything at once all the time. So how do you prioritize what you're going to focus on when? And I think leaning on the well architected structure of, you're always going to be keeping trust in mind, like that's at the forefront all the time. And if you are in a position where you need to prioritize, which you're going to be because there aren't unlimited resources or time or things like that, then making sure that you keep those, like security is always going to win out over composability, and like keeping that in mind. So I think starting with getting really good at prioritizing is probably one thing that you can do, sort of that's separate and just a great skill to have as any sort of role. And then being very intimately familiar with the framework and the principles and the priority of well architected.
Awesome. And I think that's good, solid advice there, like in terms of prioritization, whether somebody's listening to this and they're a consultant or they're an admin or they're a developer or an architect, they probably have some of those skills already and perhaps have some kind of ways of working that can kind of feed into that skill set,
Definitely.
right?
Yeah. And keep in mind that, you are going to have your priorities as someone that is focused on being more well architected, but someone else coming and working with you is going to have their own set of priorities. So that's really the hard skill of being able to like join those things and create a vision of moving forward together. And that's really one of the reasons why Salesforce created the V2 Mom, to make sure that you can plan together as a team and have a clear vision and clear values that everyone is aligned behind. So that's really the trick. Like prioritizing on your own is great. Like we can all do that. We can all come up with our own priorities, but like, how do you work as a team together? Because the work that we're doing with Salesforce and working with customers and businesses and organizations, that's a team sport. So how do you prioritize together is the real trick.
Yeah. And I guess you can use the principles within the framework to do that as well. So for example, if there was something that you were looking to do or develop and it was related to security, then that would be at the forefront. That would be very kind of high business value points or something like that. Do you kind of often see other people working in that type of way as well?
So I think it all depends on the timing too. So you're going to, I think a great analogy that actually Parker Harris shared with me was like, when we think about prioritizing at Salesforce, you are not going to decide to, one quarter not do Sales Cloud because it's not the most important priority. But it's also not at the top of our V2 mom every year. So what you're going to focus on and when changes over time, and it can always be reprioritized. So to answer your question, I would say at a beginning of a project, when you're trying to stand up a new implementation, yes, security is going to be the first thing that you want to have locked down. When you release an MVP, like security is going to be your security requirements are going to probably come first. But if you're working on a project that is a non-greenfield implementation, maybe there's an org that's been around for a while and security is looking good. You've got the basics, you're, meeting all the requirements and all of that. Maybe you focus on a different area because you're focused on composability for, this particular sprint or this particular quarter. So I think keeping in mind that priorities change over time and can always be reprioritized is also another thing to keep in mind. It's not like you set your priorities once and then you're good to go for the rest of, forever. No, you're going to be revisiting them and debating them and making sure that they still align with the team.
Yeah, totally. And I guess it makes sense too, like if there's a new compliance regulation coming out, then that would be your immediate focus, right? And perhaps something security related would be less important then, I guess.
Definitely. So I think that's a great call out to make sure that another tool that you're using, no matter what your role is, make sure that you have a clear roadmap for your customer and for your project of what you want to roll out when, and then you're keeping that roadmap very closely attuned to the Salesforce roadmap. So you know what's coming out, you know how to prioritize things like technical debt, and you have a real clear vision for what's coming. So you're not surprised and you're not working, after that compliance mandate has come out, you're not scrambling to then adhere to it. You've known that it's coming, you have a plan for it. So having really strong roadmaps and making sure that every item in your backlog ties to your roadmap is another way to make sure that you're keeping those priorities in check.
So do you think in today's ever-changing world where AI is really important, do you think that the kind of here and now there are perhaps higher priority items as part of the framework with the dawn of things like ChatGPT? The ability for a user to export all of the information out of the system and feed it into ChatGPT is quite a security risk, right? Do you think there's anything like that in today's ever-changing world in perhaps relation to AI that is perhaps shifting things or changing what traditionally would or wouldn't be a priority?
It's a great question. So I don't think that the priorities of the framework are going to change. The high level security is always going to be number one. Trust is always going to be number one for Salesforce. And regardless of what's happening with AI and generative AI, I do think that there's going to be a lot of patterns and anti-patterns that crop up that are going to be different, that we are just learning about now, or we're going to find out. Especially, I think folks are, an example is we're thinking a lot about generative AI right now and how, what are the things we need to consider with a tool like ChatGPT or with the Einstein 1 platform. But in the longer term, as AI evolves, it's not just going to be a chatbot, essentially, that you're working with. We're going to move into things like more generalized AI. We're going to move into the concept of like autonomous agents is what everyone's talking about. Like what happens when AI is not just giving you text, but it's chaining together these actions that do something without human intervention. We're going to find out a lot of anti-patterns and patterns to follow with that. But I don't think that the concepts within, of secure, easy, and adaptable are going to change. I think just the patterns that we need to look out for are going to evolve as the technology evolves.
Yeah. Okay. And perhaps the role of the system and the users that are using it will change slightly too as well. So maybe the principle there of kind of like having an engaging system is there, but how a system could be engaging could perhaps change, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a great call out. Like as we think about how people interact with just the web right now, right? Like with search, like with something as like basic for us now is Google, like how we search for information is going to change. Yes, how we interact with the system is going to change. So yeah, absolutely. An engaging experience might look different, although thinking about things like ease of use. I think the general concepts, again, are going to stay the same. Maybe we'll add some additional things as we learn. But I think, again, how you deliver the engaging experience is absolutely going to change.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so kind of casting your mind back to when you started out designing and helping to spread the word about this framework, if you were to start out on that journey of becoming more well architected yourself again, is there anything you would do differently or change?
That's a great question. So is there anything I would do differently or change? I think that I think sometimes the perfect, what is the phrase? You don't want the perfect to get in the way of the good. So you want to make sure that you're not sort of paralyzed by all of the options and all of the information. I think when we were creating Well Architected, for instance, we had to walk this fine line of making sure that we were producing something that was high quality, but that we didn't get stuck in a loop of waiting for it to be perfect so that, it took us years to come out with something, because by that time, especially now when we're talking about this new wave of AI, everything is moving so rapidly. I think the opportunity to, have an IT project that lasts 5 years or 3 years or whatever, I think those days are maybe shifting. Everything is moving at a such faster pace, keeping in mind that you need to keep moving. You need to make sure you're producing quality solutions, that your project is, healthy, but you can't be stuck in this analysis paralysis phase, because you're going to farther and farther behind. So I think that would be something that I think we were able to walk the line of when we were rolling this out, but I think is an even more important lesson now with the speed of change.
Yeah. And you can talk about change in a number of different ways. You can talk about how AI is changing everything. And then you can also talk about how perhaps Salesforce as a company is changing with new products being onboarded and new features and things coming out as well. And I guess kind of trying to tread the line between all of those things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And making sure that you're bringing people along with you, you're bringing your customers along with you, and you're riding that fine line again of having to deal with problems that you're solving for that have existed, for multiple years. So you have that long view, sort of the historical, we have to deal with today's problems, but then also bringing people along into the future as we work with all these new different technologies and products and solving the products of the future. You have to be sort of straddling both of those lines as someone who's delivering well-architected solutions.
Yeah. If you were to define some key skills and attributes it takes to be more well-architected, so the framework being trusted, easy, and adaptable, what kind of keywords or phrases would you pull out that you think describe somebody that embodies those things?
I think maybe forward-looking. So someone who's has an eye for not just solving today's problem, but what's going to happen in 3 to 5 years. I think honest. So being honest about what can be delivered, making sure you're setting those clear expectations, and that you're not, everything's fine and things are on fire. You want to be really transparent and honest with your team and with your customers, and setting expectations appropriately. Then I guess maybe one final word would be hungry. And I guess by that, I mean, not that it's lunchtime here in the East Coast, which is true, but you want to keep learning, right? I think that's super important right now, especially if you're going to be well architected in this future that's moving really quickly. You need to be hungry to keep learning. You need to be excited about all this change and being hungry to learn more, as opposed to being oh, this is all different. And I don't feel like learning about this new thing. It's a fad. It's going to go away. If that's the stance you have, I think you're just going to be falling farther and farther behind.
Yeah. And that's quite interesting. When you said hungry, I was kind of thinking, oh, where are you going with this? And my brain connected it and was hungry for change. That was how I summarized it in my head.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, because the world as we know it is changing, and it's changing rapidly. So we need to be, as you said, along for the ride. Otherwise, we're going to get left behind and stuck.
It's a really cool time. If you're watching this and you're just coming into the IT space and working in this field, it's a really cool time to be working in our line of work. So it's going to be a lot of change, but I think it's going to be a really exciting time.
Okay. Yeah, I think it is. And it's definitely interesting to see not only where AI will take us in the near future, but 3 to 5 years, it's very difficult to predict that, right?
100%. Yeah. I think we're all learning together. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So around those skills and attributes, is there a good way for people, do you think, to start building up? Because I know communication came out there and it was kind of quite a strong theme of what you were saying. Like, how can people actually get those experiences, do you think?
Right. That's a great question. So
Yeah.
it's not just, you obviously want to keep learning and using all the great resources that are out there. I think by actually, getting in the field, working on a project, even if you're watching this and you were like, oh, I want to be an architect and you're just trying to break into the field. I think a lot of these skills you get by learning as you go, working on a project, working in an IT department. So I think, obviously some of it is transferable, but my, I guess, best guidance would be to work in a place where you're learning from someone else who has these skills that you want, like find not necessarily a mentor. I feel like, you want to be working at a place where you're not the best at everything, where there's someone who you can learn from. Especially if you're starting out and trying to pick up a lot of this stuff. Like if you are the smartest person in the room or you're the best communicator in the room, you probably want to look at maybe making a transition and finding either a mentor or finding a place where you can just be constantly learning on the job, I think is probably my best advice, which is sometimes hard. I know people are like, oh, but I like my company. It's like, that's great. But if you want to learn and grow, you might need to look at another great company in your future.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And how important do you think it is that your kind of immediate network plays in that as well? So, like taking an example, we recently recorded an episode on B2C commerce. So, not that I have questions about commerce very often, but I know somebody that I can kind of ask and that would know the answer, right? How important do you think that is? And what ways can people do to help, I guess, build up their networks?
Yeah. So I think a network is incredibly important, both from knowing who you can call when you have a
Yeah.
B2C question, but also for connecting my previous answer. I think the way you're going to find that next role or learn about that next thing that you don't even know you need to learn about yet is through a strong network. That can happen even if you don't work at a big company or even if you don't have a lot of peers in your local geography. I think the best way, we're very lucky working in the Salesforce ecosystem because there is a strong network of folks that is virtual, that is sort of across the globe. I think the best way to get involved is by reaching out to your local user group. You'd be surprised if you work in a small place or live in a small area, there's probably a user group not too far from you. There are also amazing online resources and groups that have sort of formed ad hoc, lots of them, but just making sure that you're involved on and make sure that you're taking advantage of the technology that's going to help you build your network. So even something as I don't know, I was a late comer to fully embracing LinkedIn. But even making sure that you're connecting with folks that have an interest in the things that you're interested in, following those conversations online, even if you don't have a network near you in person, definitely worth your time. That's going to pay back dividends when you're actually looking for that role or looking for help. So think of that as part of the skills that you need to prepare, cultivating and building a strong network is part of your professional skill set.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that will hopefully in turn help with those communication skills as well, because sometimes you have to have not necessarily arguments, but heated debates about pros and cons of things, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I think one of the ways that I found helpful for me to get more involved and build my virtual network was stepping up and offering to teach a study session. So don't be too scared to volunteer to speak about a topic you're learning about or to bring people along with you as you learn. You don't need to be an expert to get involved in those conversations online or weigh in. That's probably the fastest way to learn. And for me, one of the best ways to learn is to teach as I go. And you could tweak your presentation this way, or did you know that you could do it that way? Having those conversations can only happen if you sort of share where you're at or share your ideas. So don't be afraid to sort of jump into the conversation.
Yeah, solid advice there. And I can totally relate to that too. So kind of moving on a little bit, but If there was one thing you'd like to change or make more people aware about the role of being more well architected, is there a myth or anything like that that you'd kind of like to bust to our audience, or any clarifications, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the myth I would like to bust is that it's someone else's job, that someone else will do it. Oh, someone else getting paid more, or someone else will handle it. I think it's everyone needs to be involved. It's like definitely a
Mhm.
team effort, because everyone has a specialty. It's like if you're an administrator or a developer, you're going to know more about the day to day and like the mechanics and the ins and outs of like these new things, versus someone who's maybe an architect or a manager of some sort. Like, you are the expert. So make sure that the choices that you're making are well architected, because everything sort of flows together and relies on each other. So don't assume it's someone else's job.
Yeah, totally. And I think some roles, dependent on what they are, you're kind of closer to the users as well. And it's really
Yeah.
important understanding what they need and what they think, and also what may be able to help them as well. So kind of lean into that, I think. Would you agree there?
100%. Yes, definitely agree.
Okay, awesome. Well, I think that's great, solid advice, and bringing today's session a little bit to a close. But before we do go, how can people connect with you and the framework to kind of learn more and start to build out their own skills of being more well architected?
Yes, definitely. So to find the framework, to give feedback, because we want to hear your feedback, go to architect.salesforce.com. The white papers, where all the information lives, is there. There's a feedback forum on every white paper. And then to connect with me, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm still on Twitter or X. Feel free to reach out. And I'd love to, connect with you, hear what you think about Well Architected.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks again for your time today, and hopefully we'll help people be more well architected themselves.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tom.
Thanks for tuning in to Be More with Tom Bassett. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave any feedback in the comments.